The morning mist hung thick over London Bridge as thousands of severed heads stared down from their pikes, their hollow eye sockets warning all who passed beneath. But on August 23rd, 1305, these rotting trophies would witness something far more horrific than their own deaths. They would watch as England's most notorious prisoner was dragged through the streets below, beginning a journey that would end in the most savage execution ever devised by medieval law. This wasn't just about killing a man, this was about destroying a legend. William Wallace had been Scotland's greatest warrior, the common-born knight who had united clans and defeated English armies that outnumbered his forces 3-1. But now, stripped naked and bound to a wooden hurdle, he was about to discover exactly what King Edward I meant when he promised to make an example that would echo through eternity. What you're about to hear isn't the Hollywood version. This is the documented reality of how medieval justice transformed a battlefield hero into chunks of meat displayed across 4 kingdoms. Here's the thing most people don't realise about medieval executions. They weren't just punishments. They were carefully choreographed performances designed to reprogram the minds of everyone watching, and Wallace's death would be the masterpiece of this dark art. By the time this story ends, you'll understand why hardened soldiers vomited at the sight, why mothers covered their children's eyes too late, and why even 700 years later, the details of what happened at Smithfield remain almost too brutal to comprehend. But here's where it gets interesting. The man they were about to butcher wasn't supposed to be there at all. Just 8 years earlier, William Wallace had been nobody special, a minor landowner's son with no claim to fame, no great destiny. Until the English came to his door. What they did that day would transform a peaceful man into the most feared guerrilla fighter in British history, and what Edward the Ram did in response would turn that fighter into an immortal symbol. The path to Wallace's capture had been paved with Scottish blood and English gold. By 1305, after years of devastating warfare, most of Scotland's nobility had bent the knee to Edward Longshanks. They'd calculated that submission meant survival, that their lands and titles were worth more than their country's freedom. But Wallace, the stubborn commoner who'd never sworn fealty to any English king, remained at large. His very existence mocked their surrender. Edward's network of spies and informants stretched across Scotland like a spider's web. Every tavern keeper, every merchant, every travelling priest could be in English pay. The king had placed a fortune on Wallace's head, £30 sterling, enough money to buy a substantial estate, and he'd made it clear that anyone harbouring the outlaw would share his fate. The pressure was relentless, suffocating. Wallace's circle of trust grew smaller by the day. The betrayal, when it came, was almost predictable in its cruelty. Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who'd recently pledged loyalty to Edward, orchestrated the trap. Some chronicles mention a servant named Jack Short, suggesting the conspiracy ran deep into Wallace's own household. The exact details remain murky, deliberately obscured by those involved. What we know is that on August 5th, 1305, near Royston outside Glasgow, Wallace walked into an ambush he never saw coming. Imagine the moment. Wallace, perhaps exhausted from years of running, finally letting his guard down among those he thought were friends. Then the sudden rush of armed men, the shock of recognition as he saw familiar faces among his captors. The historical records are sparse on his reaction, but they note he was taken alive, suggesting either surprise was complete or he chose not to die fighting. Perhaps he still believed Scottish law would protect him. He was about to learn how wrong that belief was. The journey south was its own form of torture. Wallace, the man who'd made English soldiers flee in terror at Stirling Bridge, was now paraded through English towns like a captured animal. Bound in chains, displayed in an iron cage according to some accounts, he became a spectacle for crowds who'd heard terrible tales of the Scottish demon. Children threw stones, women spat. Men who'd never seen battle shouted threats at the caged warrior who couldn't respond. But the worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or the humiliation. It was knowing what awaited him in London. Wallace understood English law. He knew what happened to those declared traitors. During those long days on the road, he had plenty of time to contemplate the specific horrors Edward had planned. And Edward, that master of psychological warfare, made sure Wallace's imagination had all the fuel it needed. London in August was a city of extremes. The Thames reeked of sewage and rotting fish. The narrow streets trapped heat and stench like an oven. And on August 22nd, when Wallace finally arrived, The entire city seemed to empty into those streets. The annals of London record that crowds of men and women poured out to see the famous rebel. This wasn't just curiosity, this was bloodlust carefully cultivated by royal propaganda. They housed Wallace overnight at the residence of William de Layer in Fenchurch Street. Can you imagine that night, knowing that tomorrow would bring not just death, but a destruction so complete that pieces of your body would be scattered across kingdoms? The guards reportedly heard him praying, though whether for deliverance or simply the strength to die well, we'll never know. What we do know is that when morning came, Wallace was ready to face whatever horrors awaited. The procession to Westminster Hall was a masterpiece of political theatre. Wallace wasn't walked or carted like a common criminal. He was mounted on a horse, surrounded by the Mayor of London, sheriffs, aldermen, and a retinue of knights. This wasn't transportation, this was a victory parade. Edward wanted every person in London to see that the great William Wallace was now utterly in his power. Westminster Hall was the largest royal hall in Europe, its massive oak beams soaring overhead like the ribs of some giant beast. On this August morning, it was packed with spectators who'd paid handsomely for the best viewing spots. The stage was literally set. A wooden platform had been erected at the south end, high enough for everyone to see what was about to unfold. And then came the cruelest joke of all. As Wallace was led to the platform, they crowned him with a laurel wreath. The London chronicles explain this was because Wallace had allegedly boasted he deserved to wear a crown in Westminster Hall. Whether he'd ever said such a thing is doubtful. What matters is that Edward's propagandists had turned Wallace's fight for Scottish independence into a pretension to kingship. The crown of laurels mocked not just Wallace, but the very idea of Scottish sovereignty. The judges sat in their scarlet robes. 5 commissioners specially appointed by King Edward for this occasion. Sir Peter Mallory, the King's Justice, led them. These weren't impartial arbiters of law. They were Edward's men, chosen for their loyalty and their willingness to deliver the predetermined verdict. The trial, such as it was, would be swift. When Sir Peter Mallory rose to speak, the hall fell silent. The charges he read were comprehensive, damning, and largely true. Wallace was accused of being a traitor to the King of England, of sedition, homicide, robbery, arson, and various other felonies. They detailed his attacks on English garrisons, his invasion of northern England, his slaughter of English subjects. They even accused him of sparing neither age nor sex, monk nor nun, painting him as a monster who killed indiscriminately. But here's the fascinating part. Under English law, Wallace couldn't actually be guilty of treason. Treason required breaking an oath of allegiance, and Wallace had never sworn loyalty to Edward. He'd been fighting for John Balliol, Scotland's rightful king, and later for the idea of Scottish independence itself. The English lawyers knew this, which is why they'd added that peculiar charge that Wallace had sought to make himself King of Scotland. It was a lie, but a necessary one to justify what came next. When Mallory finished reading the charges and asked Wallace to respond, the Scottish knight spoke the only words he would be allowed at his trial. The exact phrasing varies slightly between chronicles, but the meaning was clear and defiant. Wallace declared, "I cannot be a traitor, for I owe him no allegiance. He is not my sovereign. He never received my homage, and whilst life is in this persecuted body, he never shall receive it." Think about the courage that took. Standing there crowned in mockery, surrounded by enemies, knowing that horrific death was certain, Wallace still refused to acknowledge Edward's authority. He didn't beg, he didn't negotiate, he simply stated the truth that had driven his entire rebellion. Scotland was not England's to rule, and he was not Edward's to judge. The court's response was swift and predictable. Since Wallace had been declared an outlaw, English law stated he had no right to speak in his own defence. His statement was legally meaningless. Mallory and his fellow judges moved immediately to sentencing. What they pronounced would have made even hardened soldiers blanch. For the crime of treason, Wallace would be drawn through the streets of London to the place of execution. For robbery and homicide, he would be hanged by the neck. For his crimes against the church, burning abbeys and killing clergy, he would be disemboweled and his entrails burned before his eyes. For his treasons encompassing all these crimes, he would be beheaded and his body quartered, the pieces sent to different corners of the realm as a warning to other potential rebels. This wasn't just a death sentence, it was a blueprint for the complete annihilation of a human being. Each element had been carefully chosen for maximum suffering and humiliation. The drawing would exhaust and injure him before the execution proper began. The hanging would bring him to the edge of death without granting its mercy. The disemboweling would create agony beyond description, and the quartering would ensure that even in death, Wallace would find no peace, no proper burial, no grave where supporters might gather. But wait until you see what happens next, because the reality of carrying out this sentence would prove even more horrific than the words suggested. Within hours of the trial's conclusion, Wallace would discover that medieval executioners were artists of agony, and he was about to become their masterpiece. The moment the sentence was pronounced, the machinery of death sprang into action. Guards seized Wallace and stripped him naked, a final humiliation for a man who'd commanded armies. They bound him to a hurdle, a wooden frame designed to be dragged behind horses. This wasn't a simple restraint. The hurdle was constructed to maximize suffering, keeping the victim's body in contact with the ground while preventing him from protecting his head or vital organs. The executioners knew their craft well. They positioned Wallace face down on the hurdle, his arms stretched wide and secured with rough rope that bit into his wrists. His legs were spread and tied at the ankles, ensuring maximum contact with the ground. Some accounts suggest they placed a wooden beam under his chest to lift his head slightly, preventing him from being knocked unconscious too quickly by impacts with the cobblestones. The route from Westminster to Smithfield had been carefully planned. This wasn't the shortest path to the execution ground. Instead, it wound through London's busiest districts, covering nearly 4 miles of city streets. Edward wanted every person in his capital to see the great William Wallace reduced to a bloody, battered piece of meat being dragged through their streets. The procession moved at a walking pace, slow enough for crowds to gather and follow, fast enough to ensure continuous abrasion against the road surface. As the horses began to move, Wallace's naked body scraped against the cobblestones. The first few yards merely abraded the skin, creating raw patches that stung with each movement. But as the journey continued, the constant friction wore through the epidermis, then the dermis, exposing raw muscle tissue to the filthy London streets. Contemporary accounts describe the blood trail that marked the procession's path, growing wider and darker as more of Wallace's body was ground away by the unforgiving stones. The crowd pressed close, their behaviour orchestrated by years of public executions, some through additional abuse, rotten vegetables, stones, excrement, dead animals. Others simply watched with the fascination of those witnessing the destruction of something once thought indestructible. The guards made no effort to stop the crowd's participation. This was all part of the show, each thrown object another small humiliation, another reminder that Wallace was no longer human in the eyes of English law. But here's what the romantic retellings miss. The human body is remarkably resilient. Wallace didn't mercifully lose consciousness. Contemporary accounts suggest he remained aware throughout the journey, his eyes open, his lips moving in what observers took to be prayer. The Lanercost Chronicle notes that he seemed to be reciting psalms, though the words were inaudible over the crowd's noise. Every bump, every sharp stone, every impact registered in a nervous system already pushed beyond endurance. The dragging served multiple purposes beyond simple transport. It exhausted the victim, depleting physical reserves needed to maintain dignity during the execution proper. It began the process of dehumanization, transforming a man into a bloody dirt-caked thing barely recognizable as human. And it provided participatory entertainment for the crowd, letting them feel involved in the destruction of England's enemy. By the time they reached Smithfield, Wallace's back and buttocks had been flayed raw. Witnesses described seeing white of bone through the worst abrasions. His face, despite the slight elevation provided by the chest beam, showed evidence of repeated impacts with the ground. Broken teeth, a shattered nose, one eye swollen completely shut. Yet he still lived, still suffered, still knew worse was coming. Smithfield was London's traditional execution ground, a patch of earth soaked with the blood of centuries. On this day, it hosted a carnival atmosphere that would seem grotesque to modern sensibilities but was entirely normal for medieval London. Vendors sold meat pies and ale to spectators who'd arrived before dawn to secure the best positions. Wooden galleries had been erected for wealthy observers who paid premium prices to watch a legend die. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view. The scaffold itself stood like a theatre stage, raised high enough for everyone to see the performance about to unfold. The executioner was a professional, likely John Malveson, London's official headsman. This wasn't work for amateurs. The sentence required specific skills to keep the victim alive through multiple stages of agony. Malveson wore the traditional black hood, not for anonymity, everyone knew who he was, but as part of the ritual that transformed a man into an instrument of state justice. His assistants, usually 3 or 4 men, had prepared their tools with the care of surgeons. Knives had been sharpened to surgical keenness. The brazier glowed with coals hot enough to instantly sear flesh. Ropes, chains, and the quartering block had been positioned for maximum efficiency. Wallace was hauled up onto the scaffold, his raw flesh leaving blood smears on the wooden planks. The crowd noise reached a crescendo, then died to an expectant hush. This was the moment they'd come to see. The great Scottish rebel, the terror of English armies, the man who'd made Edward Longshanks himself rage with frustration, was about to be reduced to nothing more than meat and memory. The hanging apparatus was deceptively simple, a rough wooden gallows with a hemp rope noose. But this wasn't the merciful snap of a broken neck that later centuries would perfect. The medieval hanging was strangulation, slow and deliberate. The executioner positioned the noose with practiced care, placing the knot behind Wallace's left ear to ensure gradual constriction rather than instant death. 2 assistants hauled on the rope, lifting Wallace until his feet cleared the scaffold by perhaps 18 inches, high enough to strangle, not high enough for the weight of his body to break his neck. The crowd watched Wallace's face transform as oxygen deprivation took hold. First came the involuntary struggle, his bound hands clenching and unclenching, his legs performing the grotesque dance that gave this type of execution its colloquial name. His face turned red as blood vessels strained against the constriction, then darker red, then purple as capillaries burst under the pressure. His tongue, swollen and protruding, turned black. Bloody foam formed at his lips as damaged blood vessels in his throat ruptured. His one good eye bulged grotesquely while the swollen one wet blood-tinged fluid. The executioner watched with professional detachment, timing the strangulation perfectly. Too long, and Wallace would die, ending the spectacle prematurely. Too short, and he might recover too quickly, potentially finding strength to resist the next stage. After approximately 3 minutes, long enough for Wallace to experience the full terror of suffocation, short enough to avoid complete unconsciousness, Malveson gave the signal. The assistants released the rope and Wallace crashed to the scaffold floor. He hit hard, his abused body offering no resistance to the fall. For a moment he lay still, and some in the crowd thought he was dead. Then came the terrible gasping as his crushed windpipe tried to draw air. His body convulsed, fighting for oxygen like a landed fish. Bloody spittle flew from his mouth with each desperate breath. This was the art of the execution, not to kill quickly, but to bring the victim to death's edge repeatedly, to make him experience the terror of dying over and over again. While Wallace struggled to breathe, the executioner's assistants moved with practiced efficiency. They dragged him to a special table, constructed for this purpose, a heavy wooden frame with iron restraints at strategic points. They positioned him spread eagle and secured his limbs with metal shackles that bit into already damaged flesh. The table was tilted slightly so the crowd could see everything that was about to happen. Wallace's head was secured with a leather strap across his forehead, preventing him from looking away from what was being done to his body. What came next was so brutal that even the bloodthirsty medieval crowd showed signs of unease. The executioner approached with a specialized knife, long, narrow, and sharp enough to part flesh with minimal pressure. He made his first cut just above the groin, a precise incision that sliced through skin and the layer of fat beneath. Blood welled immediately, running in rivulets down Wallace's thighs. The crowd leaned forward, some eager, others already regretting their choice of entertainment. The emasculation was performed with clinical efficiency. Medieval executioners understood anatomy well enough to maximize pain while avoiding immediately fatal hemorrhage. The removal of Wallace's manhood was not done in a single cut but in stages, each more agonizing than the last. First the testicles, severed with careful precision and held up for the crowd's inspection before being thrown into the brazier. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, causing several spectators to retch, then the penis itself, removed with deliberate slowness as Wallace's screams echoed across Smithfield. But that was merely the prelude. The real horror began when the executioner moved to Wallace's abdomen. With the same specialised knife, he made a careful incision from sternum to pelvis, cutting through skin and muscle, but taking care to avoid the major vessels that would cause rapid death. This required exceptional skill. Too deep and the victim would bleed out quickly, too shallow, and the evisceration would be impossible. Malvoisin had performed this procedure many times, and his hand was steady. As the executioner parted the layers of Wallace's abdomen, the crowd could see his organs pulsing within. The human body's interior, normally hidden by Providence, was now exposed to hundreds of eager eyes. Some spectators turned away, others pressed closer, fascinated by this forbidden glimpse into the machinery of life. Wallace, still conscious, could lift his head slightly despite the restraint and see his own viscera exposed to the afternoon sun. The executioner reached into Wallace's body cavity with practiced hands. He grasped the intestines first, the small intestine, all 20 feet of it coiled in the abdominal cavity. With slow, deliberate movements, he began to pull. The sensation would have been indescribable, not just pain, though there was plenty of that, but a deep, visceral wrongness as organs meant to remain internal were dragged into daylight. The intestines emerged like some grotesque rope, yard after yard of glistening tissue pulled from Wallace's body and thrown into the brazier. The burning of the entrails while the victim watched served multiple purposes. Practically, it prevented the scaffold from becoming too cluttered with organs. Symbolically, it represented the destruction of the victim's inner self. Medieval thought held that the bowels were the seat of courage and emotion. Sensory, it added another layer of horror as the victim smelled his own organs cooking. The stench was overwhelming. A mixture of burning meat, fecal matter from ruptured intestines, and the acrid smoke of the brazier. Wallace's screams had transformed into something barely human, a continuous high-pitched keening that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal vocal cords. Contemporary accounts differ on whether he formed actual words. Some claim he continued to pray, calling on God and the Virgin Mary. Others say his vocalizations had passed beyond language into pure expressions of agony. What all agree on is that he remained conscious, aware, watching as the executioner methodically destroyed his body. After the intestines came the other organs. The stomach, liver, and spleen were removed with surgical precision, each held up for the crowd's inspection before joining the intestines in the flames. The kidneys required the executioner to reach deep into Wallace's body cavity, his arms disappearing up to the elbows in blood and viscera. Some accounts claim Wallace's heart was removed while still beating, though this seems medically unlikely. The blood loss and shock would have stopped cardiac function before this point. Modern forensic analysis helps us understand what Wallace experienced during this phase. The human body can survive massive trauma for a shocking amount of time. Shock would have set in quickly, but medieval executioners knew techniques to prevent the merciful unconsciousness that often accompanies severe injury. The slight elevation of the table ensured blood flow to the brain continued. The staged nature of the evisceration prevented the rapid blood loss that would bring quick death. Wallace would have experienced not just pain, but a progressive shutting down of bodily systems, a coldness spreading from his extremities as blood loss mounted, a terrible thirst as his body tried desperately to maintain fluid balance, a disorientation as his brain struggled to process the impossible signals it was receiving. Medieval witnesses report that victims of such execution could remain conscious for 10 to 15 minutes after evisceration began. 10 to 15 minutes of watching your own insides become outsides, of smelling your own organs burn, of experiencing pain that language cannot adequately describe. The crowd, initially enthusiastic, grew quieter as the procedure continued. Some left, unable to stomach what they'd come to see. Others stayed but looked away, the reality of judicial torture proving different from their expectations. At some point during this ordeal, Wallace's body began to fail in ways even the skilled executioner couldn't prevent. His remaining eye rolled back, showing only white. His screams faded to whispers, then to nothing. His chest still rose and fell, but the movements were mechanical, autonomic. Whatever made William Wallace himself, his courage, his defiance, his unbreakable will, retreated to some final redoubt of consciousness, preparing for the last assault. Recognizing that Wallace was fading, the executioner moved to complete his work. The beheading required a different tool, a heavy axe rather than the surgical knives used for evisceration. Malvison selected his weapon carefully, testing its weight and balance. This final cut needed to be clean, professional. A botched beheading would mar the ceremony's conclusion and reflect poorly on the executioner's skill. Wallace was repositioned, his mutilated body dragged to the block. What remained of his consciousness might have recognised this as mercy's approach. The crowd grew silent, understanding that the spectacle was reaching its climax. The executioner raised the axe high, sunlight glinting off the polished blade. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The dying man, the ready weapon, the watching crowd all frozen in a tableau of medieval justice. The axe fell with a sound like a butcher's cleaver hitting meat. But the first blow didn't completely sever the neck. Whether from the executioner's error or the awkward positioning of Wallace's ravaged body, the blade cut deep but not through. Wallace's body convulsed, a final surge of nervous activity. The executioner, professional pride stung, raised the axe again. The second blow was true, separating head from body with surgical precision. As tradition demanded, the executioner grasped Wallace's head by the hair and held it high, turning to show all four corners of the crowd. "Behold the head of a traitor!" he cried, the ritual words echoing across Smithfield. Blood still dripped from the severed neck, and some witnesses swore they saw Wallace's lips still moving, forming silent words, prayers, curses, or simply the last firing of dying nerves. But even death brought no end to the degradation. With Wallace now mercifully beyond suffering, the executioner and his assistants began the final phase, the quartering. This was butcher's work, requiring different tools and techniques. The body was laid out on a heavy wooden block, and the executioner exchanged his axe for a massive cleaver. The quartering wasn't random hacking, but systematic dismemberment, following established protocols. First, the arms were removed at the shoulders, the cleaver crashing through bone and sinew with wet, meaty sounds. Then the legs, separated at the hip joints. Each limb was cleaned of excess tissue and wrapped in cloth for transport. The torso, now limbless, was split down the middle, creating the 4 quarters that gave this punishment its name. The executioner's assistants worked like a well-trained butcher shop crew, catching blood in buckets, organising body parts, maintaining the ritual dignity of state-sanctioned murder. The crowd began to disperse, their bloodlust sated. Some walked away silent and thoughtful, perhaps questioning what they'd witnessed. Others chattered excitedly, comparing this execution to others they'd seen, rating the executioner's performance. Children who'd been brought to learn the wages of treason walked hand in hand with parents who explained that this was what happened to bad men who defied the king. The festival atmosphere reasserted itself as vendors made final sales to the departing audience. Wallace's head received special treatment. It was parboiled in a mixture of water and herbs, a primitive embalming technique that would preserve it for display. The process involved submerging the head in boiling liquid for a precise time, long enough to halt decomposition, but not so long as to damage the features beyond recognition. Once treated, the head was tarred for additional preservation and mounted on a pike. Within hours, it would take its place on London Bridge, joining the gallery of traitors' heads that decorated that structure. The 4 quarters of Wallace's body began their own journeys. Each was packed in salt and sealed in specially constructed barrels for transport. 1 quarter went to Newcastle, England's fortress city on the Scottish border. Another travelled to Berwick, the town Wallace had liberated in his first great victory. The 3rd quarter was sent to Stirling, site of Wallace's greatest triumph at Stirling Bridge. Sources conflict on the 4th quarter's destination, with some saying Perth and others Aberdeen, but the message was the same. Every major town in Scotland would display a piece of their former champion, a rotting reminder of English power and the futility of resistance. But here's where Edward's careful plan began to unravel. He'd intended Wallace's execution to be so horrific, so complete, that it would end Scottish resistance forever. Instead, something unexpected happened. The very brutality of Wallace's death transformed him from a defeated rebel into a martyr. The quarters of his body, meant as warnings, became shrines. Scots would secretly visit these gruesome displays, not in fear, but in reverence, drawing inspiration from the man who had refused to bend even under the most extreme torture. Robert the Bruce, who had previously collaborated with the English, was reportedly among those deeply affected by Wallace's execution. Less than a year later, he would raise the standard of rebellion again, this time successfully. When asked what drove him to risk the same fate as Wallace, Bruce allegedly replied that he'd rather die like Wallace than live as Edward's slave. The execution meant to end Scottish independence had instead galvanised it. The English chronicles, written by monks and clerics loyal to Edward, tried to portray Wallace's execution as divine justice. They emphasised his crimes against churches and clergy, painted him as a bloodthirsty savage who got what he deserved. But even in these hostile accounts, something else creeps through. A grudging respect for Wallace's courage, an unease with the extremity of his punishment, a sense that perhaps Edward had gone too far. Scottish sources, though fewer and often written years later, tell a different story. They speak of Wallace's dignity in the face of unimaginable suffering, his refusal to beg or recant, his transformation through torture into something more than human. The Chronicle of Walter Bower, written over a century later, claims Wallace spent his final moments in prayer, achieving a kind of spiritual transcendence, even as his body was destroyed. While we can't verify these pious details, they speak to how desperately the Scots needed to find meaning in the horror of their hero's death. Within days of Wallace's execution, Scottish minstrels began composing songs about his death. These weren't the glorifying ballads of later centuries, but raw, angry laments that turned English cruelty into Scottish determination. The songs spread faster than any army, carried by travellers and merchants into every corner of Scotland. The English tried to suppress these songs, recognising their danger. Singing about Wallace became a punishable offence in occupied Scotland, but this only drove the songs underground, where they grew darker and more powerful. Some of the most powerful voices spreading Wallace's legend were English soldiers who'd witnessed the execution. They'd expected to watch a demon die. Instead, they'd seen a man endure tortures that would have broken anyone, yet refused to break. These soldiers' accounts, whispered in barracks and taverns, created a counter-narrative to the official English version. Wallace the monster became Wallace the man, and somehow that was more frightening than any propaganda. The Scottish Church, despite its complicated relationship with Wallace during his life, embraced him in death. Priests who'd once urged accommodation with England now preached sermons about the martyred knight. They drew parallels between Wallace's suffering and Christ's passion, transforming a political execution into a religious allegory. This was dangerous territory, but the Scottish clergy recognised that Wallace's death had created an opportunity to unite their fractured nation around a shared sense of outrage and purpose. Even the display of Wallace's body parts backfired in unexpected ways. The quarters sent to Scottish towns were supposed to remind locals of English power. Instead, they became sites of pilgrimage. People would travel dangerous roads just to see the decomposing remains of their hero. English guards reported mysterious offerings left near the displayed quarters, flowers and ribbons appearing overnight despite strict prohibitions. Wallace's dead body was doing what his living presence had done, inspiring resistance through sheer stubborn existence. The English administration in Scotland found itself in an impossible position. Removing Wallace's remains would be seen as weakness, admitting the displays weren't working. But leaving them up created daily opportunities for Scottish defiance. Eventually, practical considerations won. The rotting quarters were quietly removed and disposed of, though rumours persisted for generations that loyal Scots had secretly retrieved and buried them. These rumours, true or not, became part of the Wallace mythology. King Edward I died in 1307, just 2 years after Wallace's execution. He died still fighting Scottish rebels, his life's work of conquering Scotland incomplete. On his deathbed, he reportedly ordered that his bones be carried with English armies until Scotland was fully subdued. Even in death, Edward couldn't let go of his obsession with crushing Scottish independence. But his son, Edward II, lacked his father's iron will. The Scottish resistance that Wallace had started and his death had energised would eventually triumph at Bannockburn in 1314. The legal precedent set by Wallace's trial and execution had lasting consequences. By treating a foreign knight as a traitor to a crown he'd never served, Edward had created a dangerous principle. Future English monarchs would use similar logic to justify brutal suppressions in Wales, Ireland, and eventually the American colonies. The Wallace execution became a template for dealing with colonial resistance, its methods refined but its essential message unchanged. Submit or face destruction not just of your body but of your very humanity. But here's what the English never understood. Sometimes martyrdom is victory. Wallace's broken body had achieved what his sword never could. It had united Scotland, not through military success but through shared outrage. Every Scot who heard the details of his execution, who imagined those final moments of agony, became a little bit more Scottish and a little bit less likely to ever truly submit to English rule. Wallace had given his people something more valuable than victories. He'd given them a grievance that would never heal. The documentation of Wallace's execution, unusually detailed for its time, suggests the English authorities knew they were making history. The careful recording of charges, the preservation of trial procedures, the detailed accounts of the execution itself all point to an awareness that this was a significant moment. They were right, but not in the way they intended. They created not the documentation of justice served, but evidence of judicial murder that would indict English rule for centuries. Modern forensic analysis of medieval execution methods confirms the horrific efficiency of hanging, drawing and quartering. Medical experts studying the procedure note that the victim would have experienced what we now understand as neurogenic shock, where overwhelming pain essentially short-circuits the nervous system. But this wouldn't have brought unconsciousness, only a strange dissociation where the victim remains aware but somehow separated from their suffering. Wallace would have experienced his destruction as if from a distance, watching his body be taken apart while his mind retreated to some protected corner of consciousness. The crowd psychology at executions like Wallace's has been extensively studied. The combination of festival atmosphere and grotesque violence created a unique social dynamic. People who would normally show compassion became participants in cruelty, their individual humanity subsumed into the mob mentality. Yet Wallace's execution seems to have pushed even these boundaries. The silence noted at certain moments, the people who looked away, the spectators who left before the end all suggest that Wallace's suffering exceeded what even a bloodthirsty medieval crowd could comfortably witness. The transformation of William Wallace from man to myth began the moment his head was mounted on London Bridge. By the time Blind Harry wrote his epic poem The Wallace in the 1470s, the historical William Wallace had evolved into an almost supernatural figure. These exaggerations weren't mere poetic license. They were necessary adaptations to make the historical Wallace match the mythical space he'd come to occupy in Scottish culture. The execution scene became the climactic centre of every Wallace retelling, each version adding new details of defiance or suffering. Some versions had Wallace singing psalms as his entrails burned. Others described mystical visions he experienced in his final moments. The common thread was the transformation of hideous suffering into spiritual triumph. Where English chroniclers saw a criminal getting justice, Scottish storytellers saw a saint achieving martyrdom. Wallace's famous declaration at trial, that he could not be a traitor to a king he'd never acknowledged, became a legal and philosophical touchstone for resistance movements. The principle that legitimate authority required consent, that sovereignty couldn't be imposed by force alone, was radical for its time. Wallace probably didn't intend to create political philosophy in his final statement, but his words outlived him to inspire theorists of resistance and revolution for centuries to come. The visceral details of the execution, preserved in medieval chronicles, serve a historical purpose beyond mere sensationalism. They demonstrate the medieval state's capacity for calculated cruelty and the ways power inscribed itself on rebel bodies. Wallace's destruction was a text written in flesh and blood, meant to be read by all who might consider resistance. Understanding the full horror helps us comprehend both the courage required to rebel against such a system and the ultimate failure of terror to sustain political control. As the years passed, Wallace's execution took on new meanings for each generation of Scots. During the Protestant Reformation, he became a proto-Protestant martyr resisting corrupt authority. In the Age of Enlightenment, he represented rational resistance to tyranny. For Romantic nationalists, he embodied the pure Scottish spirit crushed by English materialism. Each era projected its own concerns onto Wallace's broken body, finding in his suffering a mirror for their own struggles. The sites associated with Wallace's execution became politically charged spaces. London Bridge, where his head was displayed, remained a symbol of English oppression in Scottish culture long after the original bridge was demolished. Smithfield, the execution ground, developed a reputation as cursed earth where English cruelty had overreached divine tolerance. Even Westminster Hall, site of the Sham trial, carried the stain of judicial murder in Scottish memory. These physical locations anchored the Wallace story in real geography, making it harder to dismiss as mere legend. What remains constant across all versions is the execution scene. No matter how much the story is adapted, modernised or romanticised, the brutal reality of Wallace's death resists sanitisation. The hanging, drawing and quartering are too specific, too documented, too horrific to be significantly altered. This forces even the most romantic retellings to confront the price of resistance in medieval Europe. Wallace's death anchors his legend in historical reality. The English records of Wallace's execution, particularly the recently discovered pipe roll entry detailing expenses, provide inadvertent testimony to his significance. The careful accounting of costs, the detailed description of his crimes, the precise recording of where his body parts were sent all demonstrate that the English government understood this was no ordinary execution. They were making history, creating a spectacular example that would echo through time. They succeeded, just not in the way they intended. The psychological impact of Wallace's execution on Robert the Bruce deserves special consideration. Bruce had collaborated with the English, had even helped hunt Wallace at various points. Watching Wallace die for the cause Bruce had abandoned must have created profound guilt and shame. His subsequent rebellion can be read as an attempt to redeem himself, to prove worthy of the martyrdom Wallace had suffered. In this reading, Wallace's death was the catalyst that transformed Bruce from collaborator to liberator. The method of execution itself became a subject of legal and moral debate in subsequent centuries. As concepts of human rights developed, Wallace's treatment became an example of judicial barbarism that civilized nations should reject. Enlightenment thinkers cited his execution when arguing against torture and cruel punishment. Even those who accepted capital punishment as necessary began to argue it should be swift and dignified, not the prolonged spectacle of suffering Wallace endured. The final irony of Wallace's execution is that it achieved immortality for a man who might otherwise have been forgotten. Had Wallace died in battle or been quietly executed, he would likely be a minor figure in Scottish history, overshadowed by the victorious Robert the Bruce. But the spectacular nature of his death, the very extremity that was meant to diminish him, instead elevated him to mythic status. Edward I, in trying to destroy Wallace utterly, instead created a legend that would outlive the English medieval monarchy itself. 7 centuries later, in a world that still struggles with these same questions, William Wallace's horrific death remains terrifyingly relevant. His executioners thought they were destroying a rebel. Instead, they created an immortal reminder that the human spirit, even when broken, can triumph over tyranny. The echo of Wallace's defiant words at trial still resonates. Legitimate authority requires consent. Sovereignty cannot be imposed by force alone, and some principles are worth any suffering to defend.